September 20, 1960, Sands Hotel and Casino, Las Vegas, Nevada, 9:30 p.m. Dan Martin stood on stage under the spotlight in front of 2,000 people, singing "Ain't That a Kick in the Head." The crowd loved him. Always did. Martin in Vegas was magic, sold-out show. Every seat filled. People flew in from across the country, paid premium prices, $500,000 in revenue that night. For the casino. For everyone. Dean was in the middle of his third song, smiling that Dean Martin smile, easy, comfortable, making it look effortless. Then someone walked onto the side of the stage. Stage manager motioned to Dean. Dean kept singing, kept performing. But he saw the manager, saw something was wrong. Song ended. Audience applauded. Dean walked to the side of the stage, still smiling for the crowd, but his eyes were on the stage manager. "What's wrong?" The stage manager leaned in, whispered, "Sammy's here. They won't let him in." Dean's smile disappeared. "What do you mean they won't let him in?" "Casino floor. They stopped him at the entrance. Casino policy. He can't enter." Dean stood there, processing, understanding. Casino policy. The policy everyone knew about but nobody talked about. Black performers could perform on stage, could sing, could dance, could entertain white audiences. But they couldn't walk through the front door, couldn't eat in the restaurants, couldn't gamble on the casino floor, couldn't be guests. Only employees. Sammy Davis Jr, one of the greatest entertainers alive, was standing outside, denied entry. While Dean Martin performed inside, Dean looked at the stage manager. "Where is he now?" "Service entrance." Security told him to leave. Dean looked out at the audience. 2,000 people. Waiting for him to continue. Waiting for the show. Waiting for Dean Martin to make them laugh and sing. He looked at the wings. The band waiting for his cue. He looked at the casino manager standing in the back, arms crossed, watching. Dean made a decision that would cost him everything, or change everything. He walked back to the microphone. The audience applauded, expecting more songs, more jokes, more Dean Martin magic. Instead, Dean said 5 words that made the room go silent. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm done." Confusion rippled through the crowd. Done. Done with what? The set wasn't over. He'd only performed 3 songs. Dean put the microphone back in the stand, started walking off stage. The band looked confused. The stage manager rushed over. The casino manager in the back straightened up. Dean walked straight to the wings, straight toward the exit, straight toward the service entrance where Sammy was standing. The audience sat in stunned silence. Nobody moved. Nobody understood what was happening. The biggest show of the month. $500,000, Dean Martin, walking away. For years afterward, people wondered what happened next. What was said backstage, what Dean did, why the casino's policy changed that same night, how one man's decision altered Vegas history. Nobody knew. Not the audience, not the newspapers, not the other entertainers. The story stayed hidden, protected, until someone who was there decided it was time to tell the truth. Las Vegas in September 1960 was the entertainment capital of the world, the desert city that had exploded from nothing into something spectacular. Casinos lined the strip. Hotels rose into the sky. Money flowed like water. Everyone who was anyone performed in Vegas. Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Elvis Presley, the biggest, the brightest lights. But underneath the glamour was an ugly truth. Las Vegas was the most segregated city in America. Not Mississippi, not Alabama. Vegas, the irony was devastating. Black performers could entertain white audiences, could make them laugh, make them cry, make them applaud and throw money. But they couldn't walk through the front door of the casinos where they performed, couldn't eat in the restaurants, couldn't gamble at the tables, couldn't swim in the pools, couldn't even stay in the hotels. They had to stay in the West Side, the black neighborhood on the other side of the tracks. The casinos had a term for it, colored performer policy. The policy was simple and brutal. Black entertainers were employees, not guests. They could work, But they couldn't enjoy the facilities. They entered through service entrances, used separate dressing rooms, ate in segregated areas backstage, left immediately after their performances. Lena Horne, Nat King Cole, Sammy Davis Jr., all treated the same, all subjected to the humiliation. The Moulin Rouge was the exception. The only integrated casino in Vegas, black-owned, black-run, welcomed everyone, but it had closed earlier that year. Financial problems, suspicious circumstances, leaving no integrated spaces on the Strip. September 1960 was a pivotal moment nationally. The civil rights movement was accelerating. Sit-ins across the South, freedom readers preparing, the lunch counter protests, young people demanding change. But Vegas remained unchanged, untouched by the movement, protected by distance, by money, by the illusion that entertainment somehow transcended race. It didn't. The casinos were owned by white men, controlled by white men, run for white audiences. Black performers were profitable, so they were tolerated, but only within strict limits, only as entertainers, never as equals. Dan Martin in September 1960 was at the absolute peak of his Vegas power, the biggest draw on the Strip, bigger than anyone. When Dean performed at the Sands, every seat sold out weeks in advance. The casino floor filled with high rollers. The restaurants were packed. The hotel was booked solid. Dean wasn't just an entertainer. He was an economic engine. The Sands Hotel depended on him. Financially, critically, Dean performed there regularly, had a special relationship with the owners. They gave him privileges, freedom, respect, because they needed him more than he needed them. A single Dean Martin show generated hundreds of thousands in revenue. The ticket sales were just the beginning. People came to Vegas to see Dean, stayed for days, gambled thousands, ate at the restaurants, drank at the bars. The multiplier effect was enormous. $500,000 for one show wasn't the total. It was just direct revenue. The real number was much higher. Dean knew this, understood his leverage. He could work anywhere. Any casino on the Strip would book him instantly, would pay premium rates, would give him whatever he wanted. The Sands knew this too. Knew Dean was irreplaceable, knew losing him would be catastrophic, both financially and reputationally, so they kept him happy, gave him creative control, let him set his own schedule, paid him top dollar. But Dean had never used that power for anything beyond his own comfort, had never made political demands, never pushed on social issues, never threatened to leave over principle. He was there to entertain, to make money. Until September 20, 1960. Until they stopped Sammy Davis Jr. at the entrance. Until Dean had to choose between his career and his conscience. Sammy Davis Jr. in September 1960 was one of the most famous entertainers in the world. The Rat Pack television appearances, movies, albums, hit records, Broadway shows. He could sing, dance, act, do impressions, play instruments. The complete entertainer, more talented than almost anyone in show business. But in Las Vegas, he was still black, still subject to the rules, still forced to use the service entrance. Sammy was part of the Rat Pack with Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop. They performed together, partied together, were friends. But when the shows ended, Sammy couldn't join them on the casino floor, couldn't eat with them in the restaurants, couldn't stay in the same hotels. He had to go back to the West Side, to the segregated neighborhood, to the black-owned boarding houses and small hotels, while his white friends stayed in luxury suites. The humiliation was constant, degrading, soul-crushing. But Sammy couldn't fight it alone. He didn't have the leverage. If he refused to perform under those conditions, the casinos would just book someone else. There were other black entertainers who needed the money, who would accept the terms. Sammy's only power was his talent. But talent alone wasn't enough to change policy. He needed allies, white allies, people with leverage the casinos couldn't ignore. He needed someone willing to risk their own career to defend his dignity. That's where Dan Martin came in. Dan was white, had the power Sammy didn't, could make demands Sammy couldn't, could threaten to leave in ways that mattered. The casinos needed Dean more than Dean needed them. That power dynamic changed everything, made confrontation possible, made change achievable. But only if Dean was willing to use it, only if he was willing to risk everything for his friend, for principle, for what was right. The theories started immediately after that night. Among casino workers who'd been there, among audience members who'd witnessed something strange, among entertainers who heard whispers. Theory 1 was cynical. It was a planned publicity stunt. Dean and Sammy had arranged the whole thing in advance. The walkout, the confrontation, the dramatic return, all theater designed to generate headlines and position Dean as a civil rights hero. A Vegas entertainment reporter wrote, "The timing was too perfect. The Rat Pack needed publicity. Civil rights was in the news. This gave them both. Dean gets to look like a hero. Sammy gets integrated access. Everyone wins, too convenient to be spontaneous." Theory 2 suggested Dean was drunk. He'd been drinking before the show, got emotional when told about Sammy, overreacted in ways he wouldn't have sober. A casino bartender told friends, Dean was hitting the bottle harder than usual that night. When he heard about Sammy, he lost it, walked off stage, made demands he'd never make sober. Next morning, he probably regretted it but couldn't take it back. Theory 3 claimed the casino had already planned to let Sammy in. The policy was changing anyway. Dean just happened to push at the moment management had already decided to integrate. Dean gets credit for something that was happening regardless. A Sands employee years later. The owners were already talking about changing the colored policy. Bad publicity, civil rights pressure. Dean's walkout just accelerated something inevitable. He didn't force change. He just timed it well. Theory 4 involved Frank Sinatra behind the scenes. Frank was the real power player. He'd threatened the casino privately, told them to change the policy or lose the Rat Pack entirely. Dean's public walkout was just theater to make the change look dramatic. A Rat Pack historian, Frank ran the Rat Pack. Frank had the real power. Dean was the public face that night, but Frank was pulling strings backstage. That's how Frank operated. Theory 5 suggested financial dispute. The walkout had nothing to do with Sammy or civil rights. Dean was in a contract dispute with the Sands, used the Sammy situation as leverage to get better terms, disguised greed as principle. A casino executive rumoured Dean wanted more money. The Sands was negotiating hard. Dean found a moral issue he could use as leverage. Brilliant strategy, actually. Theory 6 claimed Dean returned almost immediately. The walkout lasted minutes, not the half hour some claimed. Dean made his point, got verbal assurances, came back. The dramatic version grew over time. An audience member. He was gone maybe 5 minutes. Came back. Finished the show. The legend makes it sound much longer and more dramatic. Theory 7 was dismissive, never happened at all. Urban legend that grew over decades. No documentation. No newspaper coverage. Just a story people wanted to believe about their heroes. A skeptical historian. If this really happened, why no contemporary coverage? Why no records? Sounds like myth building around the Rat Pack. Theory 8 blamed Sammy himself. Sammy asked Dean to make a scene. Wanted the publicity. Wanted to force integration. Used Dean's friendship and power for his own benefit. A Vegas gossip columnist. Sammy was smart. Knew Dean would do anything for him. Probably asked Dean to walk out. Orchestrated his own rescue. All wrong. Every single theory. Wrong. Every explanation missing what actually happened. Missing the spontaneity. Missing the genuine courage. Missing the real confrontation. For decades, nobody knew the full story. Nobody knew what Dean said to the casino manager. Nobody knew the exact ultimatum. Nobody knew how the decision was actually made. Now, you might think this was just one entertainer standing up for another, a friend helping a friend, a nice gesture that made for a good story. But here's what makes this different. Here's what makes this matter. Las Vegas in 1960 was the most segregated city in America. Not Birmingham, not Montgomery, Vegas. The city, built entirely on entertainment, had a shameful secret. Black performers could sing on stage, could dance, could make white audiences laugh and cry and applaud and throw money. But they couldn't walk through the front door of the venues where they performed, couldn't eat in the restaurants inside those venues, couldn't gamble in the casinos that paid them thousands of dollars per show, couldn't even use the same bathrooms as white patrons. Sammy Davis Jr. was one of the most famous entertainers in the world. The Rat Pack, television appearances every week, movie albums, hit known globally. But in Vegas, he had to enter through the service entrance, like a janitor, like a delivery person, like he wasn't worth the same respect as white performers who had a fraction of his talent. Dean Martin walking out of that show, stopping mid-performance, risking his Vegas career, risking $500,000 in revenue, risking his relationship with casino owners who controlled his livelihood. That wasn't just friendship. That was moral courage. That was using power to protect someone powerless. That was putting principle above profit in an industry that worshipped profit above everything. That was risking everything for what was right. But nobody knew the full story. Not for decades. Not until people who'd been there started talking. Not until the pieces came together. Not until someone revealed what actually happened in those 30 minutes. The witnesses to that night carried fragments of the story for years. A casino floor worker named Robert Chen was on duty that night, working the craps tables near the showroom. In 1975, 15 years later, he mentioned it to a civil rights researcher. Was there when Dean Martin walked off stage mid-show. Everyone on the floor started talking. What happened? Technical problem. Dean sick. Nobody knew. Management was running around panicked. We could see them on radios, making calls. Something big was happening, but we didn't know what. Show didn't resume for almost 40 minutes. When Den came back, he had Sammy Davis Jr. with him. Walked right through the casino floor. First time I'd ever seen a colored performer out there. People were staring. Some were angry, but nobody said anything because Dean Martin was there. A stage manager named Vincent Torres worked backstage that night. In 1988, he gave an interview to a Vegas history project. I was the one who told Dean about Sammy. Had to. Casino security had stopped Sammy at the entrance. Sammy was standing at the service entrance looking at the ground. I'd never seen him like that. Defeated, humiliated. When I told Dean, his whole face changed. The Dean Martin smile vanished. He looked at me and said, "Where is he?" Then he walked off stage. Just stopped mid-song and walked off. The band didn't know what to do. The audience was confused. I'd worked with Dean for 3 years, never seen him that angry. An audience member named Patricia Morrison flew in from Chicago for the show. In 1995, she told a journalist about that night. The show stopped. Dean just said done and walked off. We all looked at each other. What just happened? Some people were angry. They'd paid a lot of money. Others were worried. Was Dean okay? We waited and waited. Finally, maybe 30 or 40 minutes later, Dean came back. He had Sammy Davis Jr. with him. They walked through the showroom together. Dean got on stage and introduced Sammy. They performed together for over an hour. Best show I ever saw. But at the time, I didn't understand what had happened. Didn't understand the significance. It was years before I realized we'd witnessed something historic. A civil rights activist named Jerome Williams heard about it weeks later. In 2005, long after Dean's death, he explained the significance. The Sands policy changed on September 20, 1960. That's documented. Casino records show it. But we never knew why that specific night. Why September 20th? What changed? There were rumors, stories, but no confirmation. When the full story finally came out, when we learned about Dean's walkout, his ultimatum, his refusal to continue unless Sammy was allowed in, it all made sense. That's why September 20th, That's why the policy changed overnight instead of gradually, because Dean Martin forced it. For years, the pieces stayed scattered. The casino workers who saw fragments, the audience members who witnessed parts, the activists who documented policy changes without knowing the causes. Nobody had the complete story. Nobody knew what happened at the service entrance. Nobody knew the confrontation with management. Nobody knew Dean's exact words. Nobody knew how the decision was actually made. The full truth stayed hidden, protected by people who'd been there, kept quiet out of respect, until enough time passed, until the story mattered more than the privacy. If you were the biggest star in Las Vegas, if your presence alone filled casinos and generated hundreds of thousands of dollars, if you had more power than almost any entertainer in the city, and you saw your friend, your Rat Pack brother, being humiliated by racist policies, what would you do? Would you finish the show and complain to management later? Would you make a private phone call to casino owners? Would you wait for the right moment when it wouldn't cost you anything? Would you accept their excuses about policy and tradition? Or would you walk out mid-performance in front of 2,000 people, risk your career and your money and your relationships, and force immediate change? That's the choice Dean Martin faced on September 20, 1960. That's the decision he had to make in seconds. That's the moment that defined him as more than an entertainer. Dean walked out the stage door, down the hallway backstage, past the dressing rooms, past the equipment storage, past the staff areas, to the service entrance at the back of the building, where deliveries came in, where trash went out, where black performers were forced to enter. Sammy Davis Jr. stood there, alone, in his perfectly tailored suit, looking at the ground. Security had told him to leave, told him he couldn't be there, told him to go back to the west side where he belonged. Sammy looked up when Dean approached. His eyes were red. "Dean, man, I'm sorry. I didn't know they'd make a scene. I should have just..." Dean cut him off. "You have nothing to be sorry for. Nothing." His voice was calm, but his face showed something different. Anger. The kind Dean Martin never showed in public, not at Sammy. At the situation, at the policy, at the system that created this humiliation, at the world that made this possible in 1960 in America. "Where's the casino manager?" Dean asked a nearby security guard. The guard looked nervous. "Mr. Martin, maybe we should get him now." The guard heard something in Dean's voice, something that made him move immediately, made him radio for management, made him understand this wasn't a request. 5 minutes later, the casino manager appeared, Gerald Morrison, mid-40s. 20 years managing Vegas casinos, he knew the rules, he enforced the rules. He'd handled difficult situations before, but never with Dean Martin. Mr. Martin," Morrison said professionally, trying to maintain control of the situation. "Is there a problem?" Dean looked at him directly. "Yes, there's a problem. A big problem. Sammy Davis Jr., one of the greatest entertainers in the world, was just denied entry to your casino." Morrison's expression didn't change. He'd expected this. "Mr. Martin, you know the policy. Colored performers can work here. We pay them well, but they can't use the facilities. That's just how things are." "The facilities? You mean the casino floor, the restaurants, the front entrance, the basic dignity of being treated like a human being instead of like a servant. It's policy. I don't make the rules. The owners. Then get someone who does make the rules, because we're changing them. Tonight." Morrison shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't going the way he'd expected. "Mr. Martin, you have a show to finish. 2,000 people are waiting. Let's not make this into a situation that affects everyone." Dean stepped closer. His voice dropped, quieter, but more dangerous. "It's already a situation. Here's how this works. Either Sammy walks through that front door right now, enters this casino as a guest, not an employee, is treated with the same respect as every white performer who works here. The same respect you show me, or I walk out right now And I never work the sands again. Not next week, not next month, not next year. Never understand what that means. What that's Morrison understood completely, understood perfectly. Dan Martin was the biggest draw in Vegas, the most reliable moneymaker. When Dean performed, the sands made money, lots of money. The showroom, the casino floor, the restaurants, the bars, the hotel, everything. Losing Dean Martin would cost the sands millions, would hurt their reputation, would send a message that Dean chose principle over their venue. Other entertainers might follow. Mr. Martin, be reasonable. This policy has been in place for years. If I change it tonight, I'm opening a door I can't close. Other colored performers will demand the same treatment. It'll change everything. Good, Dean said firmly. Open it, change everything. That's exactly the point. Morrison looked at Sammy standing there, then back, calculating, weighing costs, considering options. The policy had been in place since Vegas began. But Dean Martin was worth more than any policy, more than any tradition, more than any discomfort from white patrons who didn't like seeing black people on the casino floor. Mr. Martin, if I let him in tonight, it sets a precedent. I'm not asking. Dean interrupted. I'm telling you, Sammy enters. Or I leave. Those are your only two options. Choose now. Morrison pulled out a radio, called the casino owner, Jack Entratter, part owner of the sands, the man who'd built relationships with all the big stars. He arrived 3 minutes later, looked at the scene. Dean Martin at the service entrance with Sammy Davis Jr, Gerald Morrison, looking panicked. A situation that could explode. Dean? Entratter said carefully. Let's talk about this. Nothing to talk about. Sammy gets full access. Same as me as Frank. Same as every white performer. Or I never work here again. Simple. Entratter knew Dean meant it. Could see it in his face. Hear it in his voice. This wasn't negotiation. This was ultimatum. You putting me in a difficult position. You put Sammy in a difficult position. I'm just giving you a choice. Make it. Entratter looked at Morrison, then at Sammy, then back at Dean. Made the calculation that casino owners make: money versus principle, profit versus policy. Fine. Policy changed. Mr. Davis has full access, effective immediately. Not just Sammy, Dean said. All black performers, everyone, from now on. Entratter's jaw tightened, but he nodded. All black performers, full access. You have my word. Dean looked at Sammy. You ready to walk through the front door? Sammy's eyes were wet. Dean, you didn't have to risk. Yes, I did. Come on. They walked back through the building. Not through the service entrance. Not through the back hallways. Through the main corridor. Through the casino floor. Past the blackjack tables where play stopped. Past the roulette wheels where dealers froze. Past the craps tables where dice hung in the air. Past white patrons who stopped gambling to stare. Past dealers who'd never seen a black person on the floor unless they were serving drinks or cleaning. Some people looked angry. Some looked shocked. Some looked confused. But nobody said anything. Nobody confronted them. Because Dean Martin was there. Because Dean Martin's presence legitimized it. Because if Dean Martin said Sammy belonged there, then Sammy belonged there. They walked straight to the showroom entrance, where 2,000 people had been waiting for 40 minutes. Confused, frustrated, some demanding refunds. The room went quiet when Dean and Sammy appeared. Dean walked onto the stage first. The audience applauded, uncertain, not sure what was happening. Dean picked up the microphone. Sorry for the delay, folks. Had to take care of something important, something that couldn't wait. He paused, looked at the audience. Now, I'd like to introduce someone. My friend, my brother, one of the greatest entertainers in the world. Someone who's going to help me finish this show tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, Sammy Davis Jr. Sammy walked onto the stage, through the front entrance of the showroom. Not the stage door, not the service entrance. The front, like any other performer, like any other guest, like any other human being deserving of dignity. The audience applauded. Some enthusiastically, some politely, some grudgingly, but everyone applauded. Because this was Sammy Davis Jr., because his talent transcended their prejudices. At least for tonight. Dean and Sammy performed together for the next hour. Songs, comedy, dancing. The best show Dean ever did at the Sands. Not because the performances were technically perfect, but because it meant something. Because it wasn't just entertainment anymore. It was a statement. It was a line in the sand. It was Dean Martin using his power for something beyond himself. Saying with his actions that his friend's dignity mattered more than his career. That principle mattered more than profit. That some things were worth risking everything for. Las Vegas segregation in 1960 had deep roots and ugly history. The city had grown explosively after World War II. Desert to metropolis in 15 years. Casinos, hotertainment, all built by white owners with white money for white audiences. Black people built the city, worked construction, served drinks, cleaned rooms, did the hard labor that made Vegas possible. But they couldn't enjoy what they built. The West Side was created as the designated black neighborhood, on the other side of the railroad tracks. Literally separated from the Strip. Black residents could work on the Strip but couldn't live there. Couldn't stay in the hotels. Couldn't gamble in the casinos. Black entertainers faced a particular irony. They were good enough to perform on stage, good enough to make white audiences happy, good enough to generate revenue for the casinos, but not good enough to be treated as guests. Not good enough to use the front entrance. Not good enough for basic human dignity. Lena Horne, Nat King Cole, Ella Fitzgerald, Pearl Bailey. All subjected to the same humiliation. All forced to use service entrances. All required to leave immediately after performing. The Moulin Rouge Casino opened in 1955 as Vegas's first integrated casino. Black owned, black operated. Welcomed everyone. Black and white could gamble together, eat together, swim in the same pool, but it closed in 1956. Financial problems officially, but many suspected sabotage by white casino owners who didn't want integration spreading. September 1960 was a pivotal moment nationally. The sit-in movement had started in Greensboro that February. Young black students demanding service at lunch counters. The movement spread across the South. Freedom riders were planning to challenge segregation on interstate buses. The whole country was being forced to confront racial injustice. But Vegas remained unchanged, insulated by distance, protected by money, convinced that entertainment somehow transcended racial politics. It didn't. The casinos were as segregated as any Southern diner. The policies were as racist as any Jim Crow law. The difference was that Vegas had better publicity, better image control, better ability to hide the truth behind glamour and lights. Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. had been friends since the early 1950s, met through Frank Sinatra. Frank had discovered Sammy performing in nightclubs, recognized his enormous talent, brought him into the group that would become the Rat Pack. Dean and Sammy connected immediately, both performers, both entertainers who'd fought their way up, both understood what it meant to be underestimated. Dean had fought anti-Italian prejudice, changed his name, created a character. Sammy fought racism. The prejudice was different in scope and severity. Dean could pass as generic white American once he changed his name. Sammy couldn't hide being black, couldn't escape it, couldn't perform his way out of it. But they understood each other, understood the compromises required, understood the cost of success. The Rat Pack became famous in the late 1950s. Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, Joey Bishop. They performed together, recorded together, made movies together. But Sammy's position was always precarious. The only black member. The one who couldn't do everything the others could. Couldn't stay in the same hotels. Couldn't eat in the same restaurants. Couldn't walk freely through casinos. Dean noticed, saw the humiliation, saw how Sammy handled it with grace and humor, saw the cost of maintaining dignity in the face of constant degradation. This wasn't the first time Dean had stood up for Sammy. but it was the most public, the most costly, the most consequential. Before this, Dean's support had been private, personal, making sure Sammy was included in recordings and performances, making sure he got fair pay, making sure he was treated well in contexts Dean could control. But the casino policy was beyond Dean's direct control, required public confrontation, required risk, required Dean to put his career on the line. September 20, 1960 was the moment Dean decided that private support wasn't enough, that friendship required action, that having power meant nothing if you didn't use it to protect people who didn't have power. The aftermath of that night spread quickly through Vegas. Within days, other casinos started quietly changing their policies. Not because they suddenly opposed segregation, because they couldn't afford to be less progressive than the Sands, couldn't afford to lose performers who might follow Dean's example. The Desert Inn announced policy changes. Then the Flamingo, then the Tropicana. One by one, the major casinos on the Strip began allowing black performers to use front entrances, to eat in restaurants, to gamble on the floor. It wasn't full integration. Black guests who weren't performers still faced restrictions, but it was a crack in the wall, a beginning. Sammy's career changed that night. He still faced discrimination, still encountered racism, but he could walk through the front door at the Sands, could eat in the showroom, could be seen publicly with his white friends without being shuffled to service areas. The psychological impact was enormous. Dean never mentioned the walkout publicly, never used it for publicity, never brought it up in interviews. When asked about Vegas integration, he deflected. Things change. That's good. That was the extent of his public comment. The story stayed quiet for years, known among Vegas insiders, whispered about by casino workers, discussed in civil rights circles, but never confirmed by Dean, never used for personal gain. The historical significance became clearer with time. September 20, 1960 marked a turning point. Not the end of Vegas segregation, that took years longer, but the beginning of the end. The night when a major casino changed policy not because of laws or protests, but because one entertainer said, "No more," because one man with power used it for something beyond himself. September 20, 1960. The Sands Hotel. A casino refused to let Sammy Davis Jr. enter. Dean Martin walked off stage mid-performance. His career forced the policy to change. That night, that moment changed Las Vegas history. Not eventually, immediately. Because one man chose principle over profit, chose his friend over his career, chose what was right over what was easy, chose to use his power to protect someone who didn't have power. That's what made Dean Martin more than an entertainer, more than a singer, more than a celebrity. That's what made him matter beyond the stage. The courage to risk everything for what was right. The willingness to stand up when standing up had consequences. The recognition that having power meant nothing unless you used it to help people who didn't have power. That night at the Sands became a turning point. A moment when one person's courage forced change, when individual action mattered, when friendship transcended fear. The lesson extends beyond 1960 Vegas, beyond civil rights, beyond entertainment. It's about the choice everyone faces when confronting injustice. Do you stay quiet and protect yourself? Or do you speak up and risk everything? Do you accept the excuse that that's just how things are? Or do you demand better? Do you use whatever power you have for yourself alone? Or do you use it to help others? Dean Martin answered those questions on September 20, 1960. Answered with his actions, not his words. Walked away from money and success and comfort to defend a friend's dignity. Changed history because he refused to accept injustice. If you want to see more stories about Dean Martin, the moral courage, the hidden heroism, the man who used his power for good, there's an entire playlist waiting. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.